Hi, everyone. Welcome to this evening's I Am public lecture, the first one of this academic year. My name is Vivian Howard, and I have the pleasure of being the acting director of the School of Information Management at Dalhousie. I would like to start by acknowledging that we are located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people. We also acknowledge the many contributions of the African Nova Scotian community, which has lived on this land for generations. I'd just like to cover a few brief housekeeping details. During the public lecture, if you have questions, please feel free to add them to the chat, which is on the right-hand side. You can do that at any point during the lecture. So if a question occurs to you, just add it to the chat right at the point that you think of it. When questions appear in the feed on the chat, you can upvote them by clicking on the thumbs up symbol. And the more thumbs up a question receives, the higher the priority the question will be given. And that helps to ensure that when the question period comes, that we ask the highest priority questions first, because we may not have a chance to get to all of the questions. If you would like closed captioning, there is a CC icon that you can click on to get the closed captioning. So those are the housekeeping details. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Anne Shaftel, who is a conservator and SIM adjunct faculty member. She is a fellow of the International Institute of Conservation, a fellow of the American Institute of Conservation, a member of Canadian Association of Professional Conservators, ICOM, and ICOMOS, and works internationally for archives, museums, universities, and monasteries. Since 1970, she has researched and taught in Asia, as well as extensive travel through the Middle East, Europe, and North America. Anne founded Treasure Caretaker Training, the award-winning preservation nonprofit. This evening, Anne will be speaking about traditional sacred texts and the art that makes them accessible. Traditional Buddhist texts in monasteries were inaccessible to diverse populations who had low literacy. Paintings, sculpture, music, and dance carried iconographic depictions from the texts to serve as a guide to meditation and visualization. The relationship between texts and illustrative art is traditional and ongoing, even in today's digital universe. This presentation offers you a view into traditional Buddhist monastery archives and the changing art forms that continue to illustrate sacred texts. Please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Anne Shaftel.
Thank you, Vivian. Welcome to Dalhousie University School of Information, students, faculty, and staff. Welcome to our diverse international audience of archivists, scholars, curators, conservators, scientists. To those who live in monasteries and nunneries, those who practice meditation according to traditional texts and images, and to everyone concerned about preservation of traditional texts. Thank you to professional colleagues at SIM, especially Vivian, Sandra, and Kim, for bringing us together today. And appreciation for the support of my Treasure Caretaker training team. Thank you to scholars and translators, especially Dorje Bhutia, Jules Levinson, and Jigme Wangmo. Gratitude to our funders of many individual donors, and to our foundation donors, especially the Pema Chodron Foundation. In our time together today, let's look into the world of traditional Buddhist monastery archives, and the changing art forms that continue to illustrate sacred texts. Although I am academically trained with graduate degrees in history of art and conservation, most of the information for today's presentation comes from primary sources within monasteries from 1970s onwards. I'm so grateful to my Buddhist teachers for their generous advice and critique of our work. Thank you. Karmapa's 16th and 17th. Jamgon Khantrul, the 3rd and 4th. Kamtrul Rinpoche's 8th and 9th. Gelik Rinpoche, Trangur Rinpoche, Trungpa Rinpoche, Punlap Rinpoche, Mingyur Rinpoche, Ani Pema Chodron, and more. Thank you. Conservators and archivists work with cultural heritage treasures from diverse world religions, and the sacred adds deep complexity to our work. Are texts empowered by a separate ceremony, or are they sacred because of their contents? If a text has been unopened or disrespected for centuries, is it still sacred? Is the text itself sacred, or are the contents sacred? In the 21st century, if everything is digitized, what then is the status of a digital version of a sutra? Is the digital version sacred when it is on the website, or does it become sacred once it is printed? Our discussion today is imbued with respect for the sacred nature of text and illustrative artwork. Please feel free to bring this up in your questions and to access this video for further discussion on working with sacred art. Please also note that in our discussion today, the word text is used for sacred texts, as in the book form, as well as for the words contained within. Although I have researched and published widely on texts and tankas, I work in monasteries and communities for the preservation of all kinds of treasures. For example, these masks and dance costumes are tangible art forms used in performance of sacred dance. This is based on iconography that is lifted off the page from traditional texts. It brings the text alive for so many people. Part of my professional work is consultation for museums and archives on their tangible sacred art collections. I'm called in to work closely with staff for conservation examination and to document and design treatments and preservation parameters for Buddhist collections. My interest in Buddhist art began in museums. In the 1950s, my second grade school class visited a museum and we looked at their beautiful Buddhist cultural display. That museum's now one of my clients. I also work with our nonprofit. Treasure Caretaker Training is a nonprofit organization dedicated to working closely with monks and nuns for preservation of Buddhist treasures in monasteries and communities. Preservation workshops in monasteries are ongoing in Nepal, Bhutan, and India, as well as in Western universities and Dharma centers. Monastics who have trained with us early on are now senior in their monasteries and are teaching preservation measures to others and teaching in our workshops. I often receive online questions from monks and nuns in remote monasteries, as well as from professional colleagues who are concerned about specific preservation situations. That's why we created an online preservation resource to provide practical and low-cost solutions for monasteries and their communities. The Preservation of Buddhist Treasures resource is free online It's a reference with practical information for the preservation of texts, tankas, and other forms of Buddhist sacred art. It is written in direct response to questions asked by monastics and illustrated with images from their own monasteries. All chapters have been reviewed by our Buddhist teachers, scholars, scientists, conservators, archivists, and monks and nuns, and are available currently in Hindi and Mandarin, with Nepali and Tibetan translations coming up soon. Our preservation workshops within monasteries are really popular, with active participation, especially in our risk assessment and other activities. For more information on risk assessment in monasteries and their communities, you may enjoy this presentation done with Buddhist Store Global. Safer storage for both archives, museums, and within monasteries for texts and sacred art treasures is not just about security. We offer redesign of existing monastery storage areas, as well as creating new ones. We share video interview techniques with our workshop participants and encourage them to add video to their digital documentation files. We want them to document the stories about monastery treasures that only the elders and retired caretakers remember. This can be significant in the event of a theft or in the event of a natural disaster. Documentation. In order to preserve traditional and evolving sacred art treasures, documentation and technical information are crucial so as to protect them in collaboration with this generation and share them with coming generations. In this image, you can see our workshop participants, archivists, scholars, monks and nuns, practicing documentation in one of our treasure caretaker training workshops. Here they're documenting on site in a large Buddhist temple with texts, tankas, and paintings. Those are some of our participants working really hard. Here, they're working in a team to document the condition of a traditional text. All of our activities are done in teams. In our workshop, each team presents its documentation in front of the entire participant group for their critique. So what were they documenting? Here's an example of a traditional text. Easy to pack up for travel on your favorite yak or your favorite pony. This is a traditional text in use by a Buddhist nun. It has been printed by traditional woodblock process. And please note that the image that illustrates the iconography described in the text is part of it. This is a complete form of a traditional text, although not all Buddhist texts look like this these days. And there's a text all wrapped up, similar to the diagram, in a tanka painting. If you're a Western archivist watching this and are interested in traditional Buddhist texts, you might be able to find them in your local Buddhist center or in your university library. Texts are usually wrapped in cloth, even in storage on shelves. They are unwrapped for use and then wrapped again after use. This is a very traditional way to do it, almost formulaic. Archival type book boxes are being created and used these days. And all the archivists watching this will like that. Well labeled. This is a very valuable family heirloom text that was owned by a master painter of Buddhist iconography, Ranjan. He was my Buddhist painting teacher in 1977. Although traditional texts are created from differing methods and materials according to geography and style, they are all subject to certain categories of damage. Texts are found to be stained and darkened with oil from fingers turning the pages. Butter lamp smoke and incense grit mixture was used as respectful offerings and found in temples. The pages are vulnerable to fraying around the edges and very vulnerable to insect activity. This traditional-looking text was sold to a tourist as an authentic antique monastery treasure for a lot of money. Some scholars are determining that it is a fake, made for sale to tourists as an antique. If this is so, the aging and areas of usage and darkening on the paper has been created intentionally. What do you think about this text? In the gar or tent culture that developed in the Himalayan region, entire monasteries traveled extensively to outlying areas in order to spread the teachings of the Buddha. Everything they needed and used traveled on the backs of yaks and ponies, including tents, furniture, texts, and paintings. Thangkas, for example, evolved from the long history of scroll paintings and from this nomadic lifestyle of early Buddhist monasteries. Yak hide glue, highly distilled, was the traditional binder for earth pigments in most historic traditional artwork. Traditional Buddhist texts, such as those studied and practiced in monasteries, were for the most part beyond the reach of the many and diverse people of Himalayan Buddhism, few of whom knew how to read. Moreover, scholars who lived far from the centers of education, often at great remove along the Silk Road and elsewhere, had little access through the profound texts that were held by these distant monasteries. Painting, sculpture, music, and dance carried iconographic depictions from text to serve as a guide to meditation and visualization. The relationship between text and illustrative art is traditional and ongoing, even in today's digital universe. Let's look into the world of traditional Buddhist monastery archives, those in community temples too, and the changing art forms that continue to illustrate sacred texts. For example, in this community Buddhist temple in Shanghai, beautiful calligraphies of Buddhist sutras have a place of honor on their shrine. Within a monastery, traditional texts are given a place of honor. Here in this monastery, you see texts behind glass in the bookshelves, statues, tankas, chevrons. And for this Zoom, many of you joining here, well, you may visit monasteries often, or perhaps you actually live in a monastery. But there are also people watching who have never visited a monastery at all. They've never been in a monastery and are now just learning about Buddhism. so bear with us. Texts are worthy of respect, and respect is shown to them. The Kanjur texts especially are considered words of the Buddha. Here, the Kanjur text is carried respectfully in a yearly procession. The monks on the right are offering flowers to the knowledge and blessing contained within the text, as well as to the actual physical texts. Traditional texts here are located in a prominent archive in Sikkim, Namgyal Institute. They're available for scholars and monastic researchers. You can go there. The texts are shelved and displayed respectfully. Namgyal Institute is a place I have worked several times, conducting conservation assessment, documenting the Tanka collection, and teaching 2 preservation of monastery treasures workshops for monks, nuns, archivists, scholars, artists, police, military, and others. Please join us in one. The archive is dignified and beautifully maintained with low light levels. The archive has its own traditional shrine with offerings. And the staff work in beautiful surroundings. However, in other libraries located throughout the Buddhist world, there are not enough resources to preserve the original precious texts, and funds are going only towards digitization. Within monasteries, texts are considered very valuable treasures, but very vulnerable, mostly for the Buddhist teachings they contain. This monastery, located in the mountains around Kathmandu, was so damaged in the earthquake that the main shrine hall was demolished. Important texts were salvaged and kept in a shrine hall in another building until the new Lhang temple was built. This is a statue of the representation of wisdom or knowledge, Manjushri, and a painting with Manjushri. Both hold a flower, supporting a traditional text. The historical figure in this Tanka painting is holding a traditional text, unwrapped and ready for you to read. This painting shows the traditional books all wrapped up with labels to identify them. These are paintings from Tankas. The relationship between text and illustrative art is again traditional and ongoing. When many people think of Buddhist art, they often are thinking of Tankas, prominent in museums and considered very collectible on the international art market. A Tanka is a Buddhist religious object in the form of a scroll. There's the central iconographic panel set into a textile mounting. If you're interested in Tankas, for more information, you can access this webinar. A great meditation master who's also a master painter is a rare combination. In this case, the 17th Karmapa has both figurative image and text in his own painting of Padmasambhava. Some Tankas have writing on the front and on the back, including and in addition to the empowerment syllables. Through the science of light, we can make visible the elements of texts and iconography that have been damaged. And we're able to do so without harming the original. If letters have become indistinct, it's possible to make them visible again in digital form. Our enhanced image helped with the translation. Often, text on the reverse of paintings is beautifully done. These are examples of fragile gold text and our work with post-capture apps to make the text visible again. We also use these techniques on original books and traditional texts. You might find it useful. Through centuries, Thangkas have carried iconographic depictions from texts to serve as a guide to meditation and visualization. Here's a recent example. The well-respected scholar and meditation master Dorje Rinpoche in Sikkim had in his personal archives a Buddhist lineage text that he wanted to teach from and to share with as many people as possible for their benefit. Rinpoche realized that more people look at paintings and statues than those that can, or have the Tibetan language skills, or the time to read long traditional Tibetan texts. It is possible, actually, that this has been true for centuries. Thus, Rinpoche hired a contemporary Thangka painting master to illustrate his traditional Tibetan language text. The master painter, who's on our treasure caretaker training team, lived in the monastery and painted illustrations for the text, working closely with Dorje Rinpoche to be sure that the iconography reflected accurately what the text described. This continues on a centuries-old tradition, from master painters in the past to our current time. Most painting masters had apprentices, and thus many historic paintings are actually workshop productions. Well, as are the great master painters. For example, Michelangelo was largely workshop produced. This master painter, Tsering Kelsang, is quite accomplished and sometimes works alone, like in the monastery, but also has a workshop. Because Dorje Rinpoche is elderly, and out of respect and devotion, the artist wanted to include him in the Thangka, so future generations will know what he looked like after he passes away. Although in person he is humble and dresses simply, the artist has idealized the image. He's depicted without his eyeglasses and surrounded by a lot of brocade. That's how he will be viewed in the future. Tsering Kelsang moved into the monastery for 3 years to illustrate the text. The Buddhist meditation master and the painting master worked closely together so that every detail of the text was depicted in Thangka form. This was an entire lineage text that had never been illustrated to this extent. Dorje Rinpoche also realized that these days more people could see Thangkas in the form of digital reproductions than would be able to actually see the original paintings created by the master painter. How many of us could visit this beautiful monastery in Sikkim, especially these days? So when the paintings were completed, they were photographed before they were sewn into traditional textile mountings. The prints are for sale in the monastery shop. Let's visit the monastery in Sikkim, and this is the monastery shop. Within the monastery shop, the text and illustrations created especially for the text are for sale to pilgrims, scholars, monastics, householders, and some tourists if they've received the initiations. This is a digital copy of the original sacred text that was in the archives of Dorje Rinpoche. Here is a page of the text with a painting that illustrates the iconography described on it. The Thangka reproductions are blessed, and the iconography is accurate. These are some of the reproductions. The prints are for sale, along with the text, and the painter made a point of telling me about a monk who purchased the reproduction text, but every single print, because he had received empowerment and it had become his main meditation practice. The reproductions are all over the monk's room in his monastery, and the text is on his puja table. This is his practice. Change in illustrative art form is a constant. Part and parcel of traditional societies, traditional knowledge is usually given by one person to another. However, things are changing. With the openness of the internet affording even remote members of traditional societies the opportunity to see the whole world. There's a change in the availability of traditional methods and materials. Statues, for example, formerly cast metal alloy and mercury gilded, are now found to be cast synthetic compound and plastic. These images, these statues, are located in a monastery, and they are all equally blessed. As with text and painted illustrations of it, copying's within the tradition. And it's all according to traditional methods and materials, cultural influence, but what's available now and changing cultural influences. For example, this is the third Karmapa, Ranjan Dorje, his face traditionally appearing in the moon. First on a traditional woodblock print. Next, on a wall painting in Rimtek Monastery in Sikkim, and now as a newly created Thangka. Yes, even digital art forms. This example of the representation of a teacher is done with devotion and used in monasteries. Texts are inventoried in a monastery and are being actively digitized, as we mentioned. In Delhi in 1970, I met the esteemed Jean Smith, a pioneer in preservation of Buddhist texts from all lineages. Now, private foundations and universities are interested, and texts are being actively digitized everywhere. There's a significant amount of funding for digitizing Buddhist texts, and with good reason, of course. The originals are impermanent. Impermanence is fundamental to the Buddhist understanding of life and death. And the knowledge and blessings contained within the text is being secured for future generations.
For one image is like 200 or 200 MB, sometimes it goes to 500 MB. I think that is too much, too big. So it will bring problem to our storage system. We have to, exchanging, we have to buy more. That's why
It's very high quality. But
I think it will be that's good quality so that we can read and we can also keep it for a long time. So I will explain again.
That's in India. Handwritten and hand-printed books have changed in form to machine-printed, and now they can be digitally scanned and accessed. Sacred texts can have a vastly wider audience. This is similar to the wider audience that thangkas and other forms of art that illustrate the texts now have when shared as digital images. You can find out more about what we discussed today on our website. Thank you so much for your interest. And I so look forward to a lively discussion from your own experiences. If there's not enough time for you to discuss in person today, please feel free to contact me directly. Thank you.